The imperial decree arrived at 600 hours on a Tuesday. This was not in itself remarkable. The Jurassic Empire sent decrees constantly. They were a species that communicated primarily through formal declaration, and over the 600 years of their imperial expansion they had refined the art of the intimidating proclamation to something approaching a cultural obsession. Their decrees were lengthy, carefully worded, and designed to convey absolute authority in every syllable. They arrived with full ceremonial transmission protocols, encoded in gold frequency signals that bypassed standard communication filters, and they were addressed to the ruling authority of whatever species the Empire had decided to focus its attention on next. This particular decree was addressed to the Secretary General of the United Nations of Earth and her colonies. It was also, by any reasonable measure, the most dramatic piece of writing that had ever been received by a human government. Ambassador Prita Vasquez read it 3 times before she called anyone. The first time she read it for content. The second time she read it to make sure she had understood the content correctly. The third time she read it because she could not quite believe that she had understood correctly and wanted to be certain before she shared it with anyone. She had understood correctly. She called Secretary General Amara Diallo at 6:12 hours. "Madam Secretary General," she said, "I need you to read something. Please read it completely before you respond." Diallo read it. Then there was a silence on the line that lasted approximately 45 seconds, which was, Vasquez reflected, a remarkably restrained response. Then Diallo said, "Is this real?" "Every authentication protocol we have confirms it," Vasquez said. "Gold frequency transmission, Jarathi Imperial seal, full ceremonial encoding. It is real." Another silence, then Diallo said, "They gave us 72 hours. "Yes," Vasquez said. "To formally and unconditionally surrender all human territory, all human military assets, all human governance structures, and all human economic resources to the eternal dominion of Emperor Zhar the Undying, sovereign of 1,000 worlds, inheritor of the ancient light, and rightful master of all civilizations that have come before and all that shall come after." "Yes," Vasquez said, "that is what they said." A pause, "And if we do not comply within 72 hours. Then the decree states that the full military force of the Jarathi Empire will descend upon human space. And I am quoting directly here, like the endless dark between the stars, cold and absolute and without mercy, until every trace of human defiance has been extinguished, and the memory of resistance has been erased from galactic history forever." Diallo was quiet for a moment. "That is," she said carefully, "a great deal of words." "It is," Vasquez agreed. "I am going to call an emergency session," Diallo said. "Can you be here in 2 hours?" "I can be there in 90 minutes, Vasquez said. "Good." Diallo paused. "Vasquez." "Yes, Madam Secretary General." "Do not show this to anyone else yet. I need a moment to think about how to present it." "Of course," Vasquez said. She ended the call. She looked at the decree on her screen. She read the phrase, "like the endless dark between the stars, cold and absolute and without mercy," one more time. Then, despite herself, despite 17 years of diplomatic training and a professional commitment to measured responses in all situations, she laughed. She pressed her hand over her mouth immediately. She composed herself. She was a professional. But the phrase, "like the endless dark between the stars," cold and absolute and without mercy, sat in the back of her mind for the entire 90-minute journey to the UN headquarters, and 3 more times on the way there she had to press her hand over her mouth. The emergency session of the Security Council began at 900 hours. Diallo had not shown anyone the full text of the decree in advance, which turned out to be a reasonable precaution because the reactions when she read it aloud in the chamber ranged from stunned silence to barely suppressed amusement to one representative, from the Northern European collective, who made a sound that he would later describe as a cough, but that everyone in the room recognized as something else entirely. General Marcus Acaffer, head of the United Nations Defense Force, listened to the entire decree without expression. He had spent 32 years in military command and had developed a face that revealed very little when he chose to reveal nothing. When Diallo finished reading, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Sovereign of 1,000 worlds." "Yes," Diallo confirmed. "They have approximately 840 confirmed systems under their control," General Acaffer said. We have verified this through independent astronomical observation. So the title is aspirational, said Represent. Alativ Chen. Apparently, Diallo said. Representative Nakamura from the Pacific Alliance raised her hand. The phrase rightful master of all civilizations that have come before. Does that include civilizations that no longer exist? We did not request clarification on that point, Vasquez said. It seemed like a secondary concern. And all that shall come after, Representative Nakamura continued. They are claiming dominion over civilizations that do not yet exist. The chamber was quiet for a moment. That is remarkably ambitious, said Representative Chen. General Akafer looked at the decree document. Inheritor of the ancient light, he looked up. What is the ancient light? We do not know, Vasquez said. Our cultural analysis team believes it may be a reference to a Jarathi creation mythology, but the specific meaning is unclear. So they have given us 72 hours to surrender to an emperor whose title includes dominion over non-existent civilizations and an inheritance of light whose nature is unknown, said Representative Nakamura. That is an accurate summary, Vasquez said. The representative from the South American Federation, a quiet man named Councillor Reyes who had said nothing up to this point, raised his hand. The phrase, the endless dark between the stars, cold and absolute and without mercy. He paused. Did anyone else read that and think of a particular kind of soup? Several people in the chamber made various sounds. General Akafer closed his eyes briefly. Let us focus, Diallo said, though her voice was not quite as steady as she would have liked. We have 72 hours to formulate a response. The question before us is what that response should be. The debate lasted 6 hours. The positions ranged across a spectrum from those who favored a formal and measured refusal citing specific points of international and interstellar law, to those who favored a more aggressive response outlining human military capacity in precise terms, to those who felt that the decree itself warranted a response in kind, which is to say a response that matched its energy. It was this last position, advanced initially by Councillor Reyes and then enthusiastically supported by Representative Nakamura, and more quietly but with evident approval by Ambassador Vasquez herself, that eventually carried the day. The argument was practical as well as emotional. The Jarathi Empire had sent a decree of this nature to 11 other species over the past 2 centuries. In 8 of those cases, the species in question had responded with some form of fearful submission, either immediate surrender or such obvious terror that the empire had proceeded with military action from a position of complete psychological dominance. In 2 cases, the species had responded with formal measured refusals that the empire had immediately classified as defiance and had used as justification for overwhelming force. In one case, a species called the Vethani, the response had been a technical document listing the specific military capabilities of the Vethani Defense Force in detail, which the empire had reviewed and then attacked anyway, having judged that the capabilities, while real, were insufficient to deter them. None of those responses had worked. The one variable that the Jarathi Empire had, in 2 centuries of expansion, never encountered was a species that did not take the decree seriously. Not in the sense of dismissing the threat, Vasquez explained as the debate moved toward its conclusion. The threat is real and we need to address it militarily. But in terms of the psychological dynamic, the decree is designed to establish a relationship in which they are the overwhelming authority and we are the frightened subject. Every serious response, whether submission or defiance, plays into that dynamic. She paused. A response that refuses the dynamic entirely is something they have no framework for. General Akafer, who had been listening carefully, said, "You are proposing that we respond to an imperial demand for unconditional surrender with something that makes them feel foolish." Yes, Vasquez said, that is precisely what I am proposing. Akafer was quiet for a moment. From a strictly military standpoint, he said, psychological disruption of an opponent's decision-making framework is a legitimate tactical objective. Vasquez looked at him. Are you agreeing with me, General? I am noting that the proposal has strategic merit, Akafer said carefully. He paused. I also read the phrase like the endless dark between the stars and had a similar reaction to Councillor Reyes regarding the soup. The chamber made various sounds. Diallo looked around the table. She had spent 30 years in politics and diplomacy. She had a very good sense of when a room had made up its mind. We need a response, she said. Who is going to write it? The room looked at each other. Then Representative Nakamura said, "I think we should all write it together." The response was drafted over 4 hours by a committee of 17 people that included diplomats, military strategists, a cultural anthropologist, two professional comedy writers who had been brought in on an emergency consultant basis, and Counselor Reyes, who turned out to have a gift for the particular kind of language that was required. It went through 23 drafts. The first draft was too aggressive. The second was too subtle. The third was actually quite good but included a reference that the cultural anthropologist pointed out might not translate properly across species. Drafts 4 through 11 were various combinations of the first three. Draft 12 introduced an element that everyone agreed was the right direction. Drafts 13 through 22 refined that element. Draft 23 was the final version, and when it was read aloud in the chamber, the reaction was the kind of silence that precedes unanimous agreement. It was addressed, with full ceremonial protocol, to Emperor Zhar the Undying, sovereign of 1,000 worlds, inheritor of the ancient light, and rightful master of all civilizations that have come before and all that shall come after, in care of the Zharathi imperial court. It read as follows: Your Imperial Majesty, we received your decree and read it with great attention. We particularly enjoyed the phrase like the endless dark between the stars, cold and absolute and without mercy, which several of our council members feel would make an excellent title for a novel and at least one member believes would be improved by the addition of the word slightly before cold, as in cold and slightly absolute and without mercy, though we acknowledge this may be a matter of taste. We also want to express our admiration for the ambition reflected in your claim to dominion over all civilizations that shall come after, which we feel sets an impressively forward-looking agenda and raises interesting questions about how one governs entities that do not yet exist. We have considered your offer of unconditional surrender carefully, and we regret that we must decline. We do not feel that unconditional surrender is currently in our best interest as a civilization, though we appreciate you taking the time to suggest it. We would, however, be happy to schedule a diplomatic meeting to discuss our respective positions in more detail, at a time and location convenient to both parties. We look forward to your response. Respectfully and with warm regards, Secretary-General Amara Diallo, United Nations of Earth and her colonies, speaking on behalf of all of humanity. There was a postscript. It read, "We also wanted to note that the title Emperor Zhar the Undying, while certainly distinguished, seems to create a logistical challenge in the event that you do, in fact, eventually die, as the historical record suggests that most emperors eventually do. We raise this only as a point of long-term planning. Best wishes." The chamber was silent for a moment after Diallo finished reading the final draft. Then General Akafer said with great deliberateness, "Send it." The response arrived at the Zharathi imperial court during the morning audience. Emperor Zhar the Undying was in the middle of receiving tribute delegations from 3 separate subject species, when the communications officer entered the hall and with evident anxiety approached the throne. The emperor was not a being who tolerated interruption of the morning audience. The communications officer knew this very well, which was why the anxiety was evident. But the communications officer also knew that the message was classified as an immediate response to an imperial decree, which protocol required be delivered without delay regardless of circumstances. The emperor received the message with visible displeasure. He was a large being heavily scaled, with eyes the color of amber and a presence that had been specifically cultivated over decades to communicate absolute authority. He had been emperor for 40 years. He had never been interrupted during morning audience before. He took the message from the communications officer. He read it. The hall was silent. 200 beings, subject species delegates, and imperial courtiers and guards and attendants watched the emperor read. His expression did not change. He read it again. His expression still did not change, though those who knew him well, and there were very few of those in the hall, could see something happening behind his eyes. Something that was not the cold imperial fury they had expected. He read the postscript. He set down the message. He sat very still for a long moment. Then he said in a voice carefully controlled to reveal nothing, "Clear the hall." The hall was cleared in under 3 minutes, which was a record. When the last courtier had left and the doors had been closed, the emperor sat alone on his throne and he read the message a third time. The PHR. As seemed to create a logistical challenge in the event that you do, in fact, eventually die. He was 112 years old. The title Emperor Zhar the Undying had been chosen by his predecessor, who had thought it sounded appropriately permanent. The emperor had privately had reservations about it for approximately 40 years, specifically for the reason the humans had identified. But changing an imperial title was a significant political undertaking, and he had never found the right moment. He also, privately and in the deepest part of himself that he never allowed to be visible, thought that the phrase like the endless dark between the stars, cold and absolute and without mercy, was perhaps somewhat overwrought. He had not written the decree himself. He had a team for that. They had a tendency toward drama. He summoned his first counselor, a being named Advisor Vrath who had served him for 30 years, and who was one of approximately 4 people in the Empire who were permitted to know what the Emperor actually thought. "Read this," the Emperor said. Vrath read it. His expression also did not change for most of the reading. At the postscript, there was a slight movement in his jaw. Then he set the message down and said carefully, "This is not a response we have received before." "No," the Emperor agreed. "They are declining the decree." "Oh yes." "They are declining it," Vrath said, in a manner that suggests they found it somewhat amusing. The Emperor did not reply. Vrath looked at the message again, the slightly before cold. "Oh yes." He paused. "It is objectively funnier with the slightly." The Emperor said nothing, but something shifted in his expression that Vrath, who had known him for 30 years, recognized. "The question," Vrath said carefully, "is what we do now." The Emperor leaned back in his throne. He thought about the 11 species that had received imperial decrees over the past 2 centuries. 8 had submitted immediately. 2 had defied and been destroyed. 1 had listed their military capabilities and been destroyed anyway. None of them had sent back a note about the logistical challenges of the title Emperor the Undying. He thought about what a response to this kind of thing looked like in imperial military doctrine. There was no entry in imperial military doctrine for this kind of thing. Imperial military doctrine covered submission, defiance, negotiation, and stalling for time. It did not cover a politely worded note that treated an imperial decree as though it were an only moderately convincing piece of marketing material. He thought about the phrase, "We would be happy to schedule a diplomatic meeting to discuss our respective positions in more detail." It was technically, by the standards of interstellar diplomacy, a reasonable offer. He looked at Vrath. "Get me everything we have on the humans," he said. "Everything, not the summary, everything." Vrath said, "That may take some time." "Take whatever time you need," the Emperor said. He looked at the message one more time and find out who wrote this. "I want to know who wrote this specifically." The intelligence report on humanity took 3 days to compile in full. It was thorough. The Empire maintained extensive surveillance networks across the galactic region, and humanity had been on their monitoring list for 40 years, since they first began expanding beyond their home system with a speed and enthusiasm that had flagged them for attention. The report covered population, territorial extent, military capacity, industrial output, historical record, cultural profile, and a section that the intelligence chief had labeled anomalous characteristics. The Emperor read the anomalous characteristics section first. It was the longest section in the report. It described a species that had spent 10,000 years in continuous internal conflict and had somehow emerged from that experience not weakened but extraordinarily competent. A species whose entertainment culture was saturated with tactical and strategic content to a degree that had no parallel in any other species the Empire had studied. A species that maintained, in peacetime, a relationship with the concept of warfare that most species only developed under direct existential threat. It described a species that had developed, across 2 centuries of space expansion, an industrial capacity so flexible and so deeply embedded in civilian infrastructure that the distinction between military and civilian production was, for practical purposes, meaningless. A species whose engineers were, by training and by temperament, problem solvers first and specialists second, which meant that novel challenges tended to produce novel solutions at speeds that conventional military intelligence found difficult to model. It described a species that, when presented with an imperial decree demanding unconditional surrender, had responded by forming a committee and writing a joke. The Emperor. Read this last part twice. They were not afraid, he said to Vrath, who was standing nearby. No, Vrath said. They read the decree and they were not afraid. Based on the cultural profile, Vrath said, it appears they may have found it somewhat funny. The Emperor looked at the intelligence report. He thought about the 8 species that had submitted immediately. He thought about the fear in every formal submission he had received over 40 years. The careful, calculated terror of beings who had looked at the Imperial fleet and understood what it meant and had simply stopped. He had always taken that fear as appropriate, as the correct response to Imperial power, as evidence that the Empire was what it said it was. He thought about the response he was holding in his hand, about a diplomatic committee that had apparently included 2 professional comedy writers, about a postscript concerning the logistical challenges of claiming to be Undying. He thought about the intelligence reports section on human warfare, about 10,000 years of continuous internal conflict, about a species that had fought wars that killed 80 million people and emerged from the experience not traumatized into submission but more capable, more innovative, more determined. A species that had looked at the worst things it was capable of doing to itself and had decided somehow to redirect all of that into building things and going to space and writing jokes in response to imperial decrees. He thought about what it meant that they were not afraid. In his 40 years as emperor, he had learned that fear was a reliable indicator of how a species would respond to military pressure. The fearful species submitted or broke. The defiant species, the ones who responded with threats and military posturing, were usually overcompensating for fear. The fear was still there underneath the defiance. It shaped every decision they made. A species that responded with a joke about soup was not afraid. A species that was not afraid was either very foolish or very confident. He had read the intelligence report. He did not think the humans were foolish. He looked at Vrath. Schedule the diplomatic meeting, he said. Vrath stared at him. Your Majesty. Schedule it, the Emperor said. Their Secretary-General offered. Accept the offer. He set down the intelligence report. I want to meet the people who wrote that postscript. Vrath looked at the message on the table, then at the Emperor. Then he said very carefully, are we reconsidering the decree? The Emperor was quiet for a moment. I am gathering information, he said. A commander who attacks without information is not a conqueror, he is gambling. Vrath said, and if the meeting does not resolve the question in our favor, then we will have more information than we had before, the Emperor said. And we will make a decision based on that information rather than based on the assumption that the humans are like every other species we have encountered. He paused. They are clearly not like every other species we have encountered, he said. It seems unwise to assume otherwise. The diplomatic meeting was held 6 weeks later on a neutral station. Secretary-General Diallo led the human delegation. Ambassador Vasquez came with her. So did General Okafor, who had argued for his own inclusion on the grounds that the Emperor would likely bring his own military advisors, and it was important for the humans to match that framing. He had also, though he did not state this as a reason, wanted to meet the people who had drafted the decree in person. The delegation also included, at the last minute and over the mild objection of the formal diplomatic staff, Councillor Reyes, who had been the first to suggest the response, and who had contributed several of the stronger lines, including the one about the soup. Emperor Zhar came with advisor Vrath and a small security contingent. He had decided against a large formal delegation. This was itself a departure from protocol, which specified that imperial diplomatic meetings should be conducted with full ceremonial representation. He had overridden the specification. The meeting room was neutral in design. The humans were already seated when the Emperor arrived. He had expected them to stand. They did not stand. They nodded with evident respect but without the formal deference that every other species had shown in his presence. He sat down across from them. He looked at Secretary-General Diallo. She looked back at him. She had a quality he had noticed in very few beings he had dealt with over 40 years of imperial rule. She was not performing calm. She was actually calm. Your Majesty, she said, thank you for accepting our invitation to meet. You offered the invitation after declining our decree, the Emperor said. Most species do not decline our decree. We are aware of that, Diallo said. We thought it was worth noting that a different kind of response was possible. The Emperor looked at her for a moment. He looked at the rest of the delegation. He looked at Counselor Reyes, who appeared to be the most relaxed person in the room, which was notable given the circumstances. The postscript, the Emperor said, about the title. Diallo said that was Counselor Reyes's contribution. The Emperor looked at Reyes. Reyes looked back at him with an expression of polite attention. The point about the logistical challenge, the Emperor said, it was not incorrect. No, Reyes said, we thought it was a fair observation. 40 years, the Emperor said, I have had reservations about the title for 40 years. Changing an imperial title is politically complicated. Reyes nodded sympathetically. We have similar issues with our own ceremonial language. The weight of tradition is significant. The Emperor looked at him for another moment. Then he said to Diallo, tell me about your species, not the official summary, tell me what I should actually know. Diallo considered this. We have been fighting wars for 10,000 years, she said. We are very good at it. We are also very tired of it, which means we only do it when we believe something important enough is at stake to justify the cost. She looked at him directly. We do not believe unconditional surrender to your empire is worth that cost. But we also do not believe that conflict between us is inevitable. We would rather find a way to exist in the same galaxy that does not require either of us to destroy the other. The Emperor said, you are not afraid of us. We respect your capabilities, Diallo said. We have done our research. But no, we are not afraid of you. Why not? She thought about this for a moment, because being afraid would not help us, she said. And because we have been through things that were genuinely terrifying as a species and we are still here. She paused. We have a long memory for what we have survived. It makes us harder to frighten than we might otherwise be. The Emperor was quiet for a long time. Advisor Vrath, who had been watching the human delegation throughout, leaned slightly toward the Emperor and said very quietly, in their own language, they are exactly what the intelligence report said they were. I know, the Emperor said also quietly. What do you want to do? The Emperor looked at Diallo. He looked at Vasquez. He looked at General Okafor, who had the particular stillness of a military man who was paying very close attention to everything while appearing to pay attention to nothing. He looked at Counselor Reyes, who had written a postscript about logistical challenges and was currently the most relaxed being in the room. He thought about 10,000 years of warfare redirected into space exploration and industrial development, and professional comedy writers being called in on emergency consultant basis to help draft diplomatic responses. He thought about a species that was not afraid. He thought about what it would mean to fight that species. To commit the full force of the Imperial fleet to breaking something that had survived everything it had put itself through and had come out the other side still capable of writing jokes. He thought about 840 systems, about the title sovereign of 1,000 worlds, which was aspirational and everyone in this room knew it. He thought about what he actually wanted, not what the decree had said, not what imperial tradition required. What he actually wanted, having read the intelligence report and having sat in this room with these particular beings for the past hour. He said, I want to propose an alternative to the decree. Diallo looked at him without surprise, which itself told him something. She had expected this. We are listening, she said. The Emperor said, a formal recognition agreement, mutual acknowledgement of territorial boundaries, a trade framework, an understanding that neither party will make military moves against the other without prior diplomatic engagement. He paused. Not submission, he said, partnership. Diallo looked at him for a long moment. She looked at her delegation. She looked back at him. We can work with that, she said. The agreement was signed 2 months later. It was called Informal Documentation, the Zharathi Human Mutual Recognition and Cooperation Accord. In practice, within human space and eventually within Zharathi space as well, it was called something much shorter. People called it the Joke Treaty, not with disrespect, with a particular kind of affection that attached itself to agreements that came from unexpected places and worked better than anyone had predicted. The name spread because the story spread. The story of the imperial decree and the response and the postscript about the logistical challenges of claiming to be undying, and the diplomatic meeting where Counselor Reyes had been the most relaxed being in the room. The story spread because it was funny and because it was true and because it illustrated something that humans, in particular, found satisfying. That sometimes the best response to someone demanding your submission is to refuse to take the demand as seriously as they intended. That sometimes the right answer to overwhelming authority is a politely worded note, suggesting that the phrase cold and absolute and without mercy might be improved by the addition of the word slightly. That sometimes the species that writes the better joke wins. Ambassador Vasquez gave a lecture at the United Nations Diplomatic Academy 3 years after the signing. She spoke about the Jarathi negotiation as a case study in unconventional diplomatic strategy. She talked about the decision to match the decree's energy rather than respond in kind, about the 23 drafts, about the emergency consultation of professional comedy writers, about Counselor Reyes and his gift for the precise phrase. At the end of the lecture, a student asked her, "Were you ever worried it would go wrong, that the emperor would respond to the joke with military force?" She thought about it honestly. Yes, she said, there was a version of events where that happened. The emperor could have taken it as mockery and responded accordingly. We knew that was possible. But you sent it anyway, the student said. We sent it anyway, Vasquez confirmed. Why? She thought about the 8 species that had submitted, the 2 that had been destroyed, the one that had listed its military capabilities and been destroyed regardless. She thought about every response that had tried to meet the decree on its own terms and had failed. Because she said every response that took the decree seriously had already been tried and none of them had worked. We were not going to win by playing the game they designed. She paused, so we changed the game. The student was quiet for a moment. Then they said, what if the emperor had had no sense of humor? Vasquez smiled. Then we would have had a different conversation in that meeting room, she said, and probably a different outcome. She looked at the student, but I read the intelligence report on the Jarathi Empire, and buried in the cultural analysis there was a section on imperial humor traditions. Jarathi humor is dry and formal and takes itself very seriously, but it exists. It has existed for 600 years of imperial culture. She paused. Any species that has a humor tradition can recognize a good joke. They might not always like it, but they recognize it. The student thought about this, and you thought the postscript was a good joke. She looked at him. The emperor told us privately at a reception 6 months after the signing that he had read it 3 times before he cleared the hall. She smiled. I thought it was a good joke. Counselor Reyes was asked, in the years that followed, many times about the moment when he had suggested the response, about the reasoning behind it, about what had possessed him to look at an imperial decree from a species that had conquered 840 star systems and suggest that the correct response was something that included a note about soup. He always gave the same answer. He said, I read it and it was funny, not in a mean way, in the way that things are funny when they are more serious about themselves than the situation actually warrants. And I thought if it's funny to us, it might land differently than they expect. He shrugged. And I thought that anything that landed differently than they expected was worth trying, because everything that landed exactly as they expected had already failed for everyone else. The interviewer would always ask, but were you not worried? And Reyes would always say, of course I was worried, I was terrified, but worried and terrified doesn't mean wrong. It just means you do the thing anyway and hope the joke lands. He paused each time before adding the last part. Fortunately, he would say, it landed. Secretary General Diallo served 2 more terms after the signing of the joke treaty. In her final address to the UN General Assembly, she spoke about what the Jarathi negotiation had meant to her personally, not politically, not diplomatically, personally. She said, we are a species that has spent 10,000 years learning how to fight. We are very good at it. We have learned from every conflict and we have carried those lessons forward, and we are, by any honest measure, extraordinarily capable of violence when we believe it is necessary. She paused. But we are also, she said, a species that has spent 10,000 years learning how to laugh at ourselves, at the absurdity of the situations we end up in, at the gap between how seriously certain things take themselves and how seriously they actually deserve to be taken. She looked out at the assembly. I have spent my career in diplomacy, and the most important lesson I have learned is that those 2 things are not separate. The kappa. City for laughter and the capacity for war come from the same place in us. They both require the ability to see clearly, to assess a situation honestly, to refuse to be intimidated by how something presents itself and look instead at what it actually is. She smiled. The Jarathi Empire sent us a decree that called itself like the endless dark between the stars, cold and absolute and without mercy. We read it and we saw what it actually was. A very dramatic piece of writing from a species that had never been told no. She paused, and we told them no. And we told them no in a way that allowed them to hear it. She looked at the assembly one last time. That is what we are, she said. We are the species that looks at the endless dark between the stars and says, cold and slightly absolute and without mercy. We are the species that finds the funny part and uses it. Not because we are not serious. Because we are serious enough to know when seriousness alone is not enough. She picked up her notes. We are still here, she said. We are always still here. And if you send us a decree, we will read it carefully, and we will discuss it thoughtfully, and we will write you the best response we possibly can. She almost smiled. And we will absolutely tell you if we think your title has a logistical problem. If this story made you laugh and then made you feel something deeper underneath the laugh, if that moment when the Emperor read the postscript and cleared the hall gave you a particular kind of satisfaction, then you know exactly what this channel is made of. Every week we bring you the best HFY science fiction, stories that remind you what humanity is when it is at its best. Funny and fierce and absolutely refusing to be intimidated by the endless dark between the stars. Subscribe right now. Turn on the bell. Share this with someone who needs a reminder today that sometimes the best answer is the one nobody expected. We are still here. We are always still here. The joke treaty, as it came to be known across human space, had consequences that extended well beyond the immediate relationship between humanity and the Zharathi Empire. Word travels in the galaxy. It travels slowly by some measures, quickly by others, and the story of how humanity had responded to an imperial decree with a note about soup and a postscript concerning the logistical challenges of claiming immortality traveled with remarkable speed because it was, by any objective standard, an excellent story. The 11 other species that had received Zharathi imperial decrees over the past 2 centuries heard about it. The 8 that had submitted immediately heard about it. The 2 that had been destroyed, or rather the remnants of those species still surviving under Zharathi authority, heard about it. The 1 species that had listed its military capabilities and been destroyed anyway, whose surviving population now lived in a single agricultural colony under Zharathi oversight, heard about it. The reactions varied. Some found it funny, some found it instructive. Some found it painful in the way that learning after the fact about a solution to a problem you have already been destroyed by is painful. But all of them found it significant. All of them understood in their own ways that something had happened that had not happened before. A species had looked at the Zharathi Empire and refused to perform the expected role. On the agricultural colony, where the remnants of the military capacity listing species lived under Zharathi oversight, a historian named Scholar Dreth had been compiling records of the Zharathi expansion for decades. Dreth had access to certain materials that other historians did not, partly because of proximity to Zharathi administrative records, and partly because Dreth was very old and had a very good memory and had been paying attention for a long time. When the story of the joke treaty reached the colony, Dreth read everything available about it 3 times. Then Dreth wrote a document titled A Study in Why Responses Matter, which circulated among the colony's intellectual community and eventually made its way, through channels that were not entirely official, to human academic networks. The document's central argument was simple. The Zharathi Empire, Dreth wrote, had spent 600 years building a reputation for absolute authority precisely because every species it had encountered had confirmed that reputation through its response. The fearful species had validated the fear. The defiant species had confirmed the Empire's self-image as something worth defying, which is its own kind of acknowledgement of power. The species that listed military capabilities had engaged with the Empire's own framework, which placed military capacity at the center of all assessments of value. None of them had questioned whether the framework itself was the problem. The humans, Dreth wrote, had done something that required a specific combina tion of qualities to execute. They had required enough genuine security to be unafraid, enough cultural self-awareness to recognize the absurdity in the decree, enough tactical intelligence to understand that unconventional response was more valuable than conventional response, and enough comedic timing to land the joke cleanly. He paused in the text. That last quality is underrated in diplomatic analysis. A joke that does not land is not diplomatic strategy. It is simply mockery. The humans landed the joke because they understood, perhaps instinctively, where the genuine absurdity was and how to point at it without being cruel. The Emperor could receive the response without losing face in a way that forced military action because the response was not a personal attack. It was an observation about his decree. The document concluded with a section that Dreth had titled What We Could Have Done, which was careful and honest and very difficult to write, and which acknowledged that the species that Dreth belonged to had not had the specific combination of qualities the humans had brought to the situation, and that this was a fact rather than a failure. But Dreth wrote, there is something worth noting. The humans did not develop those qualities by accident. They developed them over 10,000 years of conflict, of failing at peace and trying again, of making mistakes catastrophic enough to reshape civilizations, and then studying those mistakes and carrying the lessons forward. They arrived at the moment of the decree ready for it not because they were lucky, but because everything that had happened to them had prepared them without their knowing it for exactly this kind of challenge. He paused. We did not have that preparation. Our history gave us different tools, and those tools were not adequate for this particular situation. That is a fact. What we do with that fact going forward is the only question that matters now. The document reached Dr. Amara Akafer, who had by then moved from the Office of Galactic Relations to an academic position at the University of New Geneva. She read it and found it so precise and so honest that she contacted Scholar Dreth directly, and the two of them began a correspondence that lasted 15 years and eventually produced a collaborative academic work titled The Architecture of Readiness: How Species Prepare for Challenges They Cannot Predict. It was dedicated, in the final published version, to the Committee of 17 that had drafted the response to the imperial decree, with a particular acknowledgement of the contribution of Counselor Reyes to the postscript. Ambassador Vasquez retired from the diplomatic service 8 years after the signing of the Joke Treaty. Her retirement dinner was attended by 300 people, including, in a gesture that surprised everyone including Vasquez herself, Advisor Vrath of the Jarathi Imperial Court, who had been dispatched by the Emperor specifically to attend. Vrath delivered brief remarks on behalf of the Emperor. They were formal and measured, as Jarathi formal communication tended to be, but they contained something that Vrath had insisted on including over the mild objection of the Imperial Ceremonial Language Office. The Emperor, Vrath said, wishes to convey his personal appreciation for the quality of the diplomatic communication that initiated the process leading to the Mutual Recognition and Cooperation Accord. He considers it, in retrospect, to be one of the more instructive documents he has received in 40 years of imperial rule. He also wishes it to be known, with specific reference to the postscript of that communication, that he has been in consultation with the Imperial Title Review Committee and that a formal amendment to his official designation is currently under consideration. The dinner guests were quiet for a moment. Then Vasquez said, "May we ask what the amendment proposes?" Vrath said, with the particular precision of someone delivering information they have been instructed to deliver exactly. The proposed amendment removes the word undying and replaces it with something that the committee describes as more epistemically sustainable. Vasquez looked at Vrath. Then she said, "That is genuinely one of the most dignified things I have ever heard." Vrath said, "The Emperor felt you would appreciate it." There was laughter at the dinner table. Not the nervous, controlled laughter of a diplomatic function, but genuine laughter, the kind that happens when something is actually funny and everyone present knows it and no one is pretending otherwise. Vasquez laughed. Vrath, after a moment, made a sound that those familiar with Jarathi culture recognized as the equivalent. It was, by all accounts, an excellent retirement dinner. General Akafer wrote his memoirs 12 years after the Joke Treaty was signed. They were thorough and precise, and reflected his particular way of seeing situations, which was clear-eyed to the point of occasional bluntness, and never comfortable with sentiment for its own sake. The chapter on the Jarathi negotiation was titled Psychological Terrain, which was characteristic of his framing. He wrote about the decree and the response and the meeting with the Emperor with the same analytical attention he brought to every military engagement he had ever been involved in, because he had understood from the beginning that the negotiation was, in operational terms, a military engagement conducted through other means. He wrote about why the response had worked from a tactical standpoint. He wrote about the disruption of the opponent's decision-making framework and the importance of refusing to validate the terms of engagement that the opponent had designed. He wrote about the intelligence assessment that had informed the decision and the specific elements of Jarathi cultural profile that had suggested the joke could land rather than inflame. At the end of the chapter, he wrote a paragraph that his editor had initially suggested removing on the grounds that it was out of character, with the rest of the memoir's tone. Audiobook had refused to remove it. The paragraph read, I have spent 32 years in military command. In that time I have directed operations that have resulted in destruction on various scales, as military operations do. I have made decisions under pressure that I stand behind, and decisions under pressure that I regret, and decisions under pressure that I am still not certain about. I know what it costs to fight, and I know what it costs to lose, and I know what it costs to win. I have always believed that the best outcome of any military engagement is the one that did not have to happen. The engagement avoided through sufficient preparation or sufficient intelligence or sufficient skill in navigating the situation before it reached the point of no return. In 32 years, the closest I have ever come to that ideal outcome was sitting in a room with an emperor who had come prepared to discuss submission and leaving that room with a treaty. He paused in the text. We did not fire a single weapon. We wrote a better joke. I am not a sentimental man, and I do not say this sentimentally. I say it as a professional assessment. In the full accounting of what we achieved and what it cost, the joke treaty was the best outcome of any engagement I have been part of. I hope we remember how we did it. I hope we teach it to every young diplomat and every young officer and every young person who will one day have to face something they cannot predict and will need to find a response that was not in any manual. I hope we tell them, sometimes you look at the thing that is trying to frighten you and you find the funny part and you use it. And sometimes that is how you win. The memoir was a bestseller. The chapter on the Zharathi negotiation was the most read chapter. The paragraph that his editor had suggested removing was the most quoted paragraph. Counselor Reyes read it and sent Okafor a short message. It said, the soup line was originally going to be about a dramatic piece of music. I changed it to soup at the last minute because I thought soup was funnier. He paused. I am glad I made the right call. Okafor sent back a reply that said, so am I. The galaxy continued. Humanity continued expanding as it had been doing. The Zharathi Empire continued, restructured in certain ways that the Emperor had decided privately and without announcement were appropriate given what the past decade had taught him. The other species in the region continued their various trajectories. The mutual recognition and cooperation accord held, through disagreements and complications and the ordinary friction of two very different civilizations trying to find ways to coexist in the same part of space. There were difficult moments. There were negotiations that almost failed and trade disputes that took years to resolve and cultural misunderstandings that created genuine friction and had to be carefully worked through. The accord did not make everything easy. It made things possible. There is a significant difference. The story of the joke treaty continued to travel, to reach species that had never heard of humanity and who learned about them first through this story, which shaped initial impressions in a particular direction. Humanity, in parts of the galaxy where they were not yet directly known, had a reputation that preceded them. They were the species that had responded to an imperial decree with a note about soup. They were the species that had looked at a demand for unconditional surrender and written a postscript about logistical challenges. They were the species that had sent professional comedy writers to help draft a diplomatic response, and had been right to do so. They were, in the assessment of beings who had only heard the story and not yet met any humans directly, either very strange or very confident or both, and in either case probably not worth treating as easy prey. This reputation, it turned out, was not the worst thing to have. Secretary General Diallo, in the final year of her final term, was asked in an interview what she considered her greatest achievement in office. She thought about it for a long time. She thought about infrastructure programs and medical initiatives and the trade agreements and the territorial expansions and the various crises managed and the various disasters averted. Then she said, "We wrote a better joke." The interviewer looked at her. "That is your answer." She said, "We were in a situation that every other species in the same situation had lost. And we looked at it clearly and we found the thing that was genuinely funny about it, and we used that thing precisely and it worked." She paused. "You can know everything about military strategy and diplomatic theory and interstellar law, and it will not help you if you cannot see clearly. And sometimes seeing clearly means seeing what is actually in front of you rather than what you are supposed to see." She looked at the interviewer. What was in front of us was a very dramatic piece of writing from a species that had never been told no. We told them no. We told them no in a way they had never been told no before. And then we sat down with them and found a way to exist in the same galaxy. She picked up her coffee. "That," she said, "is what I am most proud of. Not that we won, that we found a way where winning looked like this. If this story gave you that feeling, if the moment when the Emperor read the postscript and cleared the hall made you feel exactly what it was supposed to make you feel, if you laughed and then thought about it and then felt something real underneath the laugh, then this channel is your home. Every week we bring the best HFY science fiction, stories that remind you what humanity looks like when it is at its absolute best. Funny and fierce and clear-eyed and absolutely refusing to be beaten by anything that takes itself too seriously. Subscribe right now, hit the bell, share this with someone today who needs a reminder that sometimes the answer nobody expects is the one that actually works. We are still here. We wrote a better joke. We are always still here.